Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Lunch with a Friend series of live video presentations. I'm Chris Knopp, Executive Director of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness. For over 40 years, Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness has been the leader in protecting the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness and the greater Quetico Superior ecosystem. And we've been successful because of you. The strength of our organization is all of our supporters, and you are making a difference today in keeping the Boundary Waters strong. Today, our work focuses on three areas: wilderness, people, and community. For the wilderness, there are two mines and one threat that threaten the Boundary Waters. Those mines are twin metals and polymet, and the threat is acid mine drainage from copper sulfide mining. And through legislation, through legal action and community action, we are protecting the Boundary Waters from the twin metals and polymet proposed copper sulfide mines. And we have the wind at our back, and I'm very confident we'll be successful in protecting the Boundary Waters from those mines. For people, we believe that there should be no boundaries to the Boundary Waters. And through classroom education, online programs, and scholarships to students for wilderness canoe trips, we are connecting young people of all backgrounds to the Boundary Waters. And finally, for community, we have Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness recognize that Ely, Grand Marais, and the other communities of the Iron Range and North Shore need to be successful in order to protect the Boundary Waters. These communities and the Boundary Waters have a shared faith. And all the organizations and people that are working to make those communities strong, we support. Whether it's Ely Community Resource or Incredible Ely or other organizations, we believe in what you're doing. Today, we have a great presentation for you as part of our Lunch with a Friend series. Lost in the Wild, a true story survival in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness by noted author Cary Griffith. Cary has published several books of nonfiction and fiction. His fiction books include the Sam Rivers series of adventures. You may, for those of you that get the Star Tribune, may have seen that book serialized in 2014 over several months in the newspaper. He's the author of Gunflint Birding and Lost in the Wild. These are nonfiction books, and Lost in the Wild is the subject of today's program. When I was young, I used to couldn't wait to read the Reader's Digest, the drama in Reader's life, drama in real life stories, and what we have today is a true drama in real life. The Boundary Waters is both beautiful and awe-inspiring, but nature can also be dangerous and humbling. And so today's story by Cary Griffith is the latter. It's one of where nature is both humbles us and shows its danger. A couple housekeeping items here before we begin. At the bottom of the screen there, you will see a Q&A tab. Throughout the program, please send over your questions using that tab, and we'll have Cary answer those at the end of the presentation. There's also a chat tab. If you want to make some comments that Cary can respond to, we can do that as well. So again, thank you so much for joining us for our Lunch with a Friends series of programs. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Cary Griffith. Cary, please take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you everyone for dialing in. It's an honor and a privilege to talk to your organization. I love your organization. I love what you guys are doing, and please continue. I write books about wilderness areas in both fiction and nonfiction, and I do so because I've always been really interested in wilderness areas. In particular, those wilderness areas that are up in northern Minnesota, and especially the BWCA. I mean, and this particular book my latest book is actually set off the Gunflint Trail, and you can see from this map, a lot of it burned. It's about the Ham Lake fire of 2007, and a lot of that burned in the Boundary Waters and up into the Quetico, the Canadian forest. But today, I'm actually going to talk about the first book I wrote called Lost in the Wild. And I'm going to that tells the story of two real, true life survival stories in the Boundary Waters. Actually, Dan Stevens was a canoeist. He was an Eagle Scout out of the Northern Tier Scout Camp outside of Ely. Some of you probably know about that. And he was leading a group of, he was a scout leader, and he was leading a group of scouts from Chattanooga, Tennessee, up into the Quetico. So we went through the Boundary Waters and up into the Quetico. And I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was something like a 7-10 day trip. And on his third day of the trip, he went in to find a wayward portage. And, you know, some of those portages can be difficult to find up there in the Quetico. And he walked in and disappeared. And so I tell the story about what happened in half of Lost in the Wild. I tell the story about what happened to Dan, and just as importantly, what happened to those two fathers and the remaining Chattanooga scouts, the young guys that he left in the lurch in the middle of the wilderness. And it's a harrowing story, but I have to say, Dan, one of the reasons I really was interested in the Dan story was because it was such a good juxtaposition to Jason's story. Now today, I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of Jason's ordeal. He almost died getting lost. Where Dan was a paddler, Jason was a hiker in the Boundary Waters. So who was Jason Rasmussen? Well, for starters, he was a 29-year-old third-year medical student. And now I want to impress on people as I go through Jason's story, you'll recognize places where Jason made some mistakes, right? But obviously he was a smart guy, right? You can't take the MCATs and get into medical school and go through 3 years of medical training without being pretty smart, having a really good aptitude. And that was true of Jason. He was a really smart guy. He was also a wilderness neophyte. He also had his entire October 2001 open. Now, he had actually worked with REI to go on one of their remote hiking trips to Nepal. I think he was going to go for 12 days to Nepal. But if you remember, October 2001 was right after 9/11. And in the wake of 9/11, all international flights were canceled. And so his trip got canceled. So he was all dressed up, but he had no place to go. So he was a disappointed world traveler. And he had always been interested in Minnesota's northern woods, especially the iconic Boundary Waters. But he had never really been up there. So, he was really interested in doing something like that. Unfortunately, he made his first really big mistake in a series of mistakes. And that was he went up alone. He couldn't find anybody to go along. He goes to REI. And he makes some purchases there. He buys the book Hiking Minnesota, and in there's a chapter on where he ultimately decides to go. I'll talk about that in a sec. He buys a little pamphlet called Wilderness Survival. I don't know if you've seen this. It's pretty thin, it's pretty easily digested, got great tips and stuff in it. He bought a Fisher map. Now, a lot of things Jason did were clear mistakes in judgment. But a few things that happened to him, some of which I'll illustrate and some of which I talk about in more detail in the book. A few of the things that happened to him were just bad luck. And one of them was he could have bought a McKinsey map, those brown maps, or he went to REI and he could have bought a Fisher map. He ended up buying a Fisher map of the area that he decided to go into in the Boundary Waters. Now, we're all familiar with Fisher maps, mostly from paddling in the Boundary Waters. They're usually my go-to maps to use. I have less familiarity with McKinsey maps, but I did buy the McKinsey map for this area that he was going into a while back when I was writing this book. And it had more detail about the area that he was going into. It had, it identified several different trails and stuff that were in the area. If he had bought that, he might have had a better sense of where he was going into than he did with the Fisher map. But unfortuitous, he bought the Fisher map. And then he also bought a whistle. And finally, one of the other things he bought there was a Kodak Instamatic camera. Now, this is interesting because today you don't see these cameras anymore. But back in 2001, before iPhones were ubiquitous, you would, we all take pictures now with our iPhones, but back then you could buy this Instamatic camera, take pictures. I think there were 26, 27 pictures in these little cameras. You bring it back, you take it to the photo development store or your local drugstore, and they develop the pictures, and you have the pictures of your trip. Now, I have Jason has given me the pictures that he took during that trip, and I think they're really interesting because they sort of show a photo journal of what Jason is going through in every step of his ordeal. Now, I was only able to, because reproducing pictures in books is expensive, I was only able to put 3 in the book. But today I'm going to share about 19 of them. And they're in chronological order. So they give you an idea of what Jason was seeing as he progressed from bad to worse in his ordeal. Okay, in the book Hiking Minnesota, he finds a chapter on the powwow trail, and he thinks, this is perfect. This is exactly what I want to do. And one really smart thing that Jason does is he sits down with his mom on the weekend before he's going to go up there. He's going to drive up there on a Monday, and hopes to come back on a Wednesday. And he says, Mom, this is where I'm going to go. I'm going to drive up to this parking lot for the powwow trail right here. And you can see this is the BWCA boundary right here. So it's right on the edge of the boundary waters. I'm going to park here. And the first day, Monday, midday, I'm going to hike up here, find the trail. I'm going to hike counterclockwise. And the first night, Mom, I'm going to spend near Poe's Lake. Then the next day, I'm going to hike all the way over here to Superstition Lake. And then that Wednesday, I'm going to hike all the way out. And this is important, Mom. If you don't hear from me by Wednesday night, call the authorities, call the sheriff's office, because something's awry. That was really smart to do. Now, one of the things Chris said you guys would be interested in is where the powwow trail is in relation to the boundary waters. And I pulled this map off the U.S. Forest Service site on the powwow trail yesterday, and it's really good and it's interesting for a number of reasons. One, it shows you that right down here, the powwow trail is right, sort of hugs the central southern border of the boundary waters, right? It's probably, as the crow flies, 30 miles from east of Ely. Another thing that this is really interesting, it says travel is only recommended from the trailhead to Poe's Lake, where Jason was talking about going for the first day of his journey, right? Now, I've given this presentation to the Boundary Waters Advisory Committee. They're a group of probably 60 to 100 volunteers who are working with the Forest Service to actually keep the entire powwow trail open, and they have their work cut out for them. One of the reasons the Forest Service recommends not going further on the powwow trail than up Poe's Lake is because this area was burned over in the Pagami Creek fire, and there's a lot of burned over fallen logs up in here, and there's a lot of work to be done by that organization I mentioned. Now, when I told them what Jason was talking about doing, they laughed because they know how rugged this trail is, and they would be shocked that he would be able to do this in 3 days. So again, it's an example of Jason didn't really know what he was getting into. This is the first picture Jason takes with his camera, right? He's up there, he goes up to, you go up 61, you turn left on Highway 1, you go through Finland, you go through Isabella, and on the Forest Service roads, on the way to the powwow trail parking lot, he stops his car, and he leans out of the window and he takes this first picture. And he takes it because two things strike him. One, there's a fair amount of snow on the ground. We know from going up north in late October that this can easily happen. There can be much more snow than this. So he's surprised by the snow, but it's okay. He has boots, he has winter gear with him. He's okay. But the other thing he notices is how dense the forest is up here. And that really surprises him. So he finds the parking lot, he gets out of the car, he gets his gear, he starts hiking up the trail. And after 1 mile, he crosses a bridge over the Isabella River and he takes this picture. And this is exactly why he's come up here. It's a beautiful picture. And you can see a couple things about this. The snow that was here is actually starting to melt. So the weather is moderating a little bit. But you can also see it's really overcast. And that overcast sky stays throughout the day. And it becomes important later and into tomorrow, the next day, because he doesn't see where the sun sets or where it rises in the morning. The third picture he takes is this one, and it's of the start of the Powwow Trail. And you can see that it's open, spacious, really clear. It looks like the obvious path to follow. Now remember, he brought the Hiking Minnesota book with him with the highly stylized map of the Boundary Waters, of the Powwow Trail. And he brought the Fisher map with him, and he brought a compass with him. But the trail is so obvious that he just thinks, well, I'll just keep hiking on the trail. I don't really need to pull out any of that extra gear. I'll just keep going. And that's indeed what he does. And he takes this picture. The area is actually pretty boggy. This is a beaver dam. This shows you how soggy the trail is. And what he does is he actually heads up, he does exactly what he says he does. He finds the trail, he goes counterclockwise, he makes this turn on the far eastern side of the trail, and he keeps heading north. Now, when I talk to people in around 2001 that were familiar with the Powwow Trail, they said, unless you are looking for it, there was no way to see this turn. It's so overgrown. There's nothing that marks it. And remember, this is a wilderness area, so there's no signage. I've hiked most of the Superior Hiking Trail, and you can go about 100 yards, and every 100 yards or so, you see a trail sign. You either see their periwinkle splash of color on a tree, or you actually see one of their emblems, right? This is a wilderness area, so there's no signage, as you guys well know. So he keeps hiking and he's not paying much attention, but the obvious path continues north. It's an old logging road or an old portage road. And he keeps going north and he keeps going north, and he doesn't find Poe's Lake, obviously, but by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he decides this is where he wants to pitch his tent for the night, and that's what he ends up doing. And remember now, it's overcast, so he doesn't really have a clear sense of where the sun sets. So the next day, he wakes up here. Now, this is a search and rescue map, and a couple things about this. It shows you a lot more detail. Remember when I referenced the McKinsey map, the McKinsey map would have shown you more of this detail, not all of this detail, but the old Powwow Trail before the 67 Act, that Wilderness Act that created the Boundary Waters, the old Powwow Trail consisted of a west loop, a north loop, and an east loop. Now, the only thing that John Pukite talked about in the Hiking Minnesota book is this west loop, as though it was the entire trail. Prior to 1967, too, remember, there was a lot of logging going on in the area. So in the book, I refer to a lot of these logging trails as sucker trails. And so if he would have known this, he probably would have been paying more attention, but he didn't. He wakes up in the morning, he has breakfast, he breaks camp, and he keeps hiking and following the obvious, open, spacious, clear trail. He keeps hiking, and mid to late morning, he comes to this. He takes this next picture. The trail has been open and obvious, so he hasn't gotten out his compass or his maps, but he keeps walking. It keeps getting narrower and narrower until he looks in front of him, and this is all he sees. And he thinks, wow, somewhere I lost the trail. So he actually turns around and tries to recover it. Now, in the book, I talk about something called the rule of dominant handedness. And what happens for most of us is that if we're left-handed and we don't have, say, a mountaintop or a geologic thing to keep our path straight, we will actually hike in a big circle. If we're right-handed, we'll hike in a big right-handed circle. And he sort of does that. He goes back, he tries to recover the trail, he finds it, he ends up getting turned around, and in about 2 hours later, hour or two later, he comes back almost to the same place. And he thinks, okay, that's it. This is not what I came to the North Woods for. And so he decides, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get out he looks at his highly stylized map and he thinks, okay, I must be around Poe's Lake. He isn't actually, he's up in here somewhere. I must be, or up a little bit further north and to the east. But he thinks he's around Poe's Lake, and he thinks, okay, I'm wet, I'm cold. You know what? I'm going to get out my compass. I'm going to get out my Fisher map and tuck it into the drawstring of my coat. And I'm going to hike due south, paying attention to my compass until I intersect the southern part of the trail, and then I'm going to hike out. Today is Tuesday. Maybe I'll get down to the North Shore, have a burger, and drive home tomorrow. And indeed, that's what he does. So he hikes, he gets out his compass, and he starts hiking south, paying attention to the needle. He hikes and he hikes, and he comes to what he thinks is this lake. He takes this picture. Now, you'll notice it's kind of looks sunny. Well, he's been bushwhacking through wet woods all day. It's been overcast, and as if it's ordained, this is 3 or 4 in the afternoon. The skies open up. It's the first time he's had an open area, and he thinks, I'm just going to pitch a tent and have some food. I'm tired, I'm cold, I'm wet, and I'll hike out tomorrow. Now, when he looks at this, now as he's been hiking, he's been bushwhacking, and that Fisher, Minnesota map, not that it did a lot of good for him, but the Fisher, Minnesota map actually gets pulled out of the drawstring of his coat, and he loses that. So the only map he has now of the area is this hiking Minnesota map. And when he looks at it, he thinks it's a lake. It was actually a beaver pond. But he thinks, oh, I must be at the north end of this fallen arch lake. So tomorrow he'll be able to do that. So he pitches his tent. You can see he hangs up some of his clothes to dry out there. He takes a picture of it. And then the next day when he wakes up, it's raining out. And rather than get up in the rain, cold rain, and break up his camp and start hiking south, he decides, I'll just stay put, wait until the rain stops. And he actually reads the survival guide that he bought at REI earlier. One of the things he sees is, just stay put if you get lost. So he doesn't really think he's lost at this point. So he reads this, and around noon, the rain finally stops, and he gets up and he gets out, and he thinks, well, everything is so wet, and I'm just going to give it a little time to dry out before I pack it all up. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to get a waste pack together. I'm going to put some basic supplies in it, and I'm going to head south and find the trail, and then I'll come back and get my supplies and pack them up when they're more dry. And this is not a picture he takes. This is a picture that was taken after that has everything that he walked away from his tent with in that waste pack right there. He carried a can of tuna, some Tootsie Rolls, a water bottle, his whistle. He actually carries a writing instrument of some kind, of pen or a pencil. But most importantly, he doesn't take any matches with him. That was a terrible mistake. So he gets out and he starts heading south, and he actually takes, this is another picture he takes of that area, thinking, well, I'm just going to head south. There's no way I can lose a lake. And he gets out his compass. Now, one of the things that has happened in this area south of where he is that, remember, this was 2001, and there was that big blowdown event on July 4th of 1999 in the Boundary Waters. It really leveled a wide swath across the Boundary Waters, and it hit other areas intermittently throughout. And one of the areas that it hit was the area that he's now walking into. So he has his compass out in front of him. He starts walking, and he sort of, to get around the down timber, he jogs left, he climbs over it, he jogs right. He ends up, over the course of a couple hours, veering about a quarter mile to the west, just because of the blowdown and everything else. It gets to be later in the day, and he thinks, this is crazy. I'm going to go back to my tent. I have food. I'll just stay in my tent. One thing about that tent I forgot to mention is, if you saw it, it was orange. And if you're flying over in a search and rescue plane, it's going to stick out like in a plane of green, or even if it snows, in a plane of white, like an obvious flag. And he thinks, okay, I'll just go back and I'll sit tight. Some people will come and they'll find me after my mom calls tomorrow night and I'm not home. And so he walks and he keeps heading south. And then so he starts heading back north. Now he must at this point pay closer attention to his compass. Regardless, by about 4:30 in the afternoon, he hasn't found this lake. He hasn't found his tent and supplies. It's getting colder. It seems like a storm is moving in. And he comes to a bog that he can't walk around, and he decides to go straight through it, kind of walk on the grassy hummocks, and he falls in and he gets wet up to his knees, or he gets the lower part of his legs. And it's a really devastating moment, probably the most devastating moment of his ordeal, because he realizes it's getting cold. He has no shelter. He could freeze to death and die out here. And so he starts frantically looking around for something. He thinks about digging a pit under a boulder. He comes to one of those fallen old growth logs that has sort of a piece of it still intact up on top that could be kind of a roof. And he realizes that its middle has been kind of rotted out. And so he has a knife, he starts digging out, and he realizes that this is the fallen log. He realizes that if I can hollow out this log, I might be able to have a big enough space in there to hunker down for the evening. And that's exactly what he does. He cuts some branches to act as insulation, and as night settles and the wind picks up, he has this, meager shelter to survive through the night. And that's what he does. Now, again, I mentioned that there were some unfortuitous things that happened to him. And one was what happened to him this night. When he wakes up in the morning, that's his shelter. He takes this picture. A snowstorm hits in the middle of that first night. And not only is Jason's hollowed out tree right in the center of 6 to 12 inch snowfall. But more importantly, remember that orange tent that was sitting there? Now, if that orange tent was in a field of snow, a field of white, it'd stick out like a sore thumb. Unfortunately, the tent has also been covered. So any search and rescue plane going over it is just going to see a plane of snow. Now, the other thing, Jason takes this picture, and you can see from this picture, there's no way Jason can try and go find his tent and supplies. If he walked through that sort of wet, cold snow, he'd be soaked and cold and become hypothermic in a matter of minutes. And so he knows he has to stay put. Now, remember, this is Wednesday, right? So Wednesday night, sure enough, he hasn't shown up. Wednesday night, his mom calls the authorities around 9 o'clock, and they dispatch a deputy up to the parking lot of the powwow trail. It's in the middle of the snowstorm. And so they find Jason's car, and they, blare their siren and do some other stuff. But the deputy doesn't, Jason is nowhere to be seen. And so the deputy thinks, well, you know what? He's probably hunkered down in this snowfall, and he's going to hike out tomorrow. So tomorrow comes, he doesn't hike out. He's stuck here in his hollowed out tree. And by the end of Thursday, they call out the search and rescue. This is another picture of his shelter, and you can see he's sort of insulated the inside of it. But you can also see it's still snowy and pretty cold. This is a picture, I think, that really sort of epitomizes how cold it is. That's another shot of his hollowed out tree. So as dusk falls on that second night, the search gets underway. Unfortunately, it's still sub-freezing. So the snow, remember his tent is covered by the snow has not melted. This is not a picture he took. This is search and rescue headquarters back at the parking lot of the powwow trail. And the search and rescue, after researching this book and researching some other more tragic stories that happened of people missing in the woods. If I ever get lost in the woods, and I should have backed up and told you one of the reasons I wrote this book and researched Jason and Dan and found those people is because I have been lost in the woods, and I have paddled in the boundary waters. And I remember I was on Seagull Lake, which has, I think, 250 islands, and I get lost a fair amount. And one hike I went on 22 years ago with my sons and a buddy of mine and his son, and a 2-hour hike up one side of the Cascade River, what we thought was going to be really easy, and down the other, turned into a 5-hour death march because we got lost. And now this is a wilderness area, so it's even more remote, no signage whatsoever. So if you ever get lost in Minnesota, do so in Lake County, because the Lake County Sheriff's Office is assisted by a search and rescue, Lake County search and rescue volunteer team that really know what they're doing. Along with the Forest Service and DNR, there were a lot of participants. It takes a village, and these guys did it. Now, what was interesting between this and the Dan Stevens story that I also talk about is if you go missing in Canada, the Ontario Provincial Police have a concerted search and rescue effort, and they're really well resourced, and they know how to search for people because they have a fair amount of missing people up in the woods. And I'd also say if you're going to get lost in the woods, do so in the Quetico. Okay, so the searchers, now remember, Jason was really good. He told his mother where he was going. He told how he was going to hike the trail. And so the searchers fan out over every section of the powwow trail, but of course they don't find him. They spend the next 3-4 days. They actually at one point bring in search and rescue dogs that are scent tracking dogs. And the weather finally, after the 7th day of his ordeal, one thing he does is that search and rescue planes are going over. I think they flew over 50 sorties over the area, the powwow trail and the area surrounding it. And Jason gets in a habit. This is really important. Jason gets in a habit, and as soon as the plane goes over and gets out of earshot, he blows his whistle because he thinks, and with good reason, that there are probably searchers on the ground and maybe somebody will hear his whistle. So it's just a habit that he gets into. The weather finally moderates. It starts getting warmer. The snow starts melting. And by the 7th day of his ordeal, the 5th day of the search, the snow melts off his tent. Not long thereafter, a search and rescue plane goes over, and the pilot can't believe what he sees. And he radios back to search and rescue headquarters, and he says, "You won't believe this. There's a tent in the middle of nowhere. Not only is it in the middle of nowhere, it's in this really boggy area. He can't even figure out how the guy got into that area. And so he radios the GPS coordinates back to the search and rescue headquarters. It turns out there's 2 Minnesota DNR conservation officers in the field that are closest. Unfortunately, they have to get to it. They have to go a quarter to a half mile through a cattail swamp. They get to the tent, they open it up, and what do they find? Well, they find all of Jason's supplies. They don't find Jason. Moreover, Jason has been a really good ecologist, leave no trace. I think he had 4 meals. He had a dinner, a breakfast, a dinner, a breakfast, and a dinner and a breakfast. So all of the packaging from those 4 meals he has packed, he put into his pack to carry out. And so they can determine from that packaging how long he's been missing. Well, he's been missing over 7 days, or 7 days anyway. And so they think, okay, you can't have been missing over this last week with this kind of weather, this sub-freezing temperatures, and have survived without any shelter. So they no longer consider this a search and rescue. They consider this a search and recovery, because they think what they're looking for now is a body. And they bring in, there are a variety of different kind of scent tracking dogs, some of which are trained to recover bodies, dead bodies. And so they bring in cadaver dogs along with the scent tracking dogs. Now, one of the things that happens this day when they find his tent, the 2 conservation officers are there, and then some other people with dogs show up, and the dogs are acting a little squirrely, one of the search and rescue guys said. So the truth is, Jason is probably a quarter to a half mile from here, and the dogs are acting squirrely. But in another stroke of terrible fate, they're thinking about following the dogs at that point, but they get a call from search and rescue headquarters, and headquarters says, get out of the field. There's an ice storm coming from the northwest. And sure enough, everybody gets out of the field, and Jason is still stuck there that night. Now, this is a picture of how Jason gets his water during the day. Remember, he walked away with a water bottle, but he knows he can't eat snow because it'll lower his body temperature and it'll become hypothermic. He's already been cold so long, he's gradually, slowly becoming hypothermic. But what he does is he stuffs that water bottle with snow, and then he brings it into his shelter at night, and his body temperature melts enough snow so that by morning he can sip water all day, and that's what sustains him. That's what keeps him hydrated through his ordeal. He also, remember, had a writing utensil, pen or a pencil, and he uses that. He thinks he's getting close to dying because he hasn't had anything to eat for a week, very little water. He's becoming more hypothermic. And so he writes a note on, it's really a goodbye letter to his family, on birch bark. The last picture he takes with his instant camera is this one. This is the last night he's in the woods. And you can see the storm kind of rolling in the back, and he's saying goodbye to his family, and because he doesn't think he's going to last that much longer. And so he just waves goodbye to his family, and he gets into his hollowed out tree. And indeed, an ice storm comes through, and by the morning, the temperatures moderate, everything's wet, but searchers get back in the field, and they decide they're going to go into the field. They're going to go back to that tent from 2 different locations. One is from the south, and another group of 5 with a couple of dogs are going to come in from the north. And they actually end up coming in sort of along Jason's route, the original route that he took to get there. And they come in, and mid-morning, late morning, a plane goes over, a search and rescue plane. And Jason does what he's always done, his habit. As soon as it gets out of earshot, he blows his whistle. Now, one person in that 5-person search and rescue group hears him. They say, did you hear that? and nobody else has heard anything. And so fortunately, Jason blows again, and now they're still, and another one hears it, and they start walking towards him, and one guy goes out in front with a dog, and he sees Jason through the woods, actually through a lot of fallen down timber, that blowdown that I mentioned. And he looks at him and he says, well, who are you? Because remember, now they think they're looking for a cadaver. And he looks at him, he says, I'm Jason Rasmussen. And they cannot believe it. And they radio back, and the guy is fine. And it's just astounding to everyone that he can survive 7 days like that, 8 days by himself in a hollowed out tree. Now, this picture was taken just moments after he was found, and you can see they've given him a space blanket to get warm and given him water, and I think they gave him some badly needed Snickers and some food, but he was in pretty good shape. So it was really a remarkable story, and sort of a cautionary tale too, about mistakes made to me that were very understandable. There was one deputy I interviewed who said, you know, that guy was cheating Darwin. And I don't agree. Having been lost in the woods many times myself, and having been lost paddling in the boundary waters, I know how easy it is for that to happen. And I just think there were a number of unfortuitous bad luck incidents that compounded his problem. Okay. Any questions?
Great, Cary. Thank you so much for that excellent overview of your book and the real life drama with Jason Rasmussen there. Before we get to some questions here, want to let people know that a couple things here. So if you want your Lost in the Wild, you can go to any area bookstore that pretty much carries it. Also, you can get it online. And we will, at the end of this, we are have all the names of the participants that have, and attendees for this webinar. Cary Griffith has generously donated a book of his own that we will have a drawing from all the attendees. So, but you can buy the book here, and if you happen to be the lucky winner, you can give it to a friend or family member here. You know, maybe to start off, kind of piggybacking on something that you just said here, Cary, was Jason a victim of circumstances, or was he a victim of his own mistakes, or a little bit of both?
Well, I definitely think a little bit of both. You know, some of those things were just so unlike. Obviously, some of them were really big mistakes. I mean, I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to who have read this book, and as soon as he walks away from his tent, they're like, what? Don't do that. Because that was, and especially don't walk away without matches or some way of making fire. So that was a clear mistake. But other things like buying the Fisher map instead of the McKinsey map, or, you know, the snowfall that happened that first night, he would have been found if it hadn't, you know, snowed on him like that. He would have been found right away because of that tent. So it was a combination of things. He definitely made some mistakes, but I really have a lot of empathy for him because I know what it's like out there. You're muted.
Unmute myself. Thank you, Cary. Along those lines, so what lessons do you think can be drawn from Jason's experience then?
Well, first and foremost, have a good sense of where you're going, what you're walking into. I think I mentioned Jason was a wilderness neophyte. He'd done hiking and stuff, but never up north. Never. He was unfamiliar with that wilderness, and as we know, that's very different than the area in the south, or it's more deciduous forests and stuff. And as we also know, if you hike around state parks and stuff, everything is well marked, pretty well marked. You know, it's difficult to go to get lost in some of those places. So really know where you're going into, and probably also don't go into them alone, particularly if it's your first place walking into a wilderness like that. Go with a guide or find somebody to go with. You know, I'd say those two things first and foremost not to do.
Great. So what 5 essentials should Jason have had with him when he left his tent?
Well, he definitely should have had a way to make fire.
Mm-hmm.
If he would have had a way to make fire, he would not only stayed warm, but they would have seen the smoke and he would have been rescued. Because he thought he was coming back, first and foremost, that's the biggest thing he should have had. Because he thought he was coming back, I suppose he could have had more food with him and stuff, but again, he didn't think he was going to end up that way. So the only other things are like items like a space blanket, you know, a way to retain your heat, and ideally a space blanket that's like that orange one that you saw him in at the end. That's great too, because if he would have had that when he was he could have spread it out on the ground and people would have seen it. The search and rescue people would have seen it flying over. As it was, he was wearing the khaki colored stuff, and he blended in. There were a few times the plane went over, and he said they were so close he could see the pilot in the window. But he was unable to do it. So apart from those things, you know, those things would be important. Definitely a way to somehow make water, maybe even having a life straw. I don't know if there was a body of water near him where he could have bushwhacked over and had some water, but those things I think would have been essential.
And if Jason had gone clockwise instead of counterclockwise on the powwow, do you think that would have been easier for him?
Well, probably. Although it's interesting that now the Forest Service says to do exactly what he did his first day. It may be that when you go left, you hit a lot of blowdown, or, well, now you hit a lot of Pagami Creek fire remnant, I think. But he might have, if he would have gone clockwise, he might have gotten over to Superstition Lake that first night and seen how rugged the trail was and maybe turned around and decided to hike out rather than doing the whole circuit. So it could have been, you just don't know what the nature of the trail was. When I was looking for people to talk about, I interviewed this one guy and his son who I think they went hiking on the Powwow Trail in the winter. They did winter camping, and because of all the blowdown on the trail, they got hopelessly lost and they ended up getting helicoptered out. So it just depends on how the trail was, if he would have gone clockwise rather than counterclockwise. I've hiked that first part of the trail going the way Jason did, not all the way up to where he didn't turn west where he should have, but up to that point B on the map. And it's pretty clear and straight. And, you know, in that sense, for him, it was kind of seductive. And I think it's so, you know, it just added to his problems.
You know, Cary, what other writing projects do you have going on right now? What are you working on?
Well, I've got 2 more novels coming out, one of which is set on Lake Vermilion. And anyway, those are all Sam Rivers mysteries. They're going to reissue my first novel, Wolves, this coming spring. And then Savage, Minnesota is going to be issued as a book by Adventure Keen under a different title. Both of those are being edited and sort of rebranded. And then they're going to be followed by these other 2 novels. But the nonfiction project I'm working on is about the July 4th, 99 blowdown. And I'm really looking for, thanks for asking, by the way. I'm really looking for people who were in the blowdown, in the boundary waters to interview. I've already found several who I've interviewed. I've written about 50, 60 pages of that story. And that was such an iconic Boundary Waters event that I think it really needs to be covered. And so if any of your listeners are interested, they can reach out to me via my website, interested and willing to share their stories. If they were in the Boundary Waters during that time, I'd love to talk to them.
Great. So we have on the screen there, you have Cary's email and his website, and you also have our email as well, our website there. So contact Cary directly or go through our website here, and we'll be able to get some and help you with that your next nonfiction project there, Cary. So thank you. You know,
thank you.
And so, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much again, Cary, for a great presentation and a great telling of a fascinating story here. Our next Lunch with the Friends program will be on Wednesday, August 19th at 12 noon. And right now, Kim Young, Quetico Kim Young, our board member and a contributor to the Boundary Waters Journal, is up in the Boundary Waters right now. And she will come back and in 2 weeks and talk about talk cooking and how to make great meals in the Boundary Waters. And she'll bring back stories from her trip that she's on right now about how to make great meals in the Boundary Waters. And thank you all of you out there that have attended this program. Again, you are the strength of Friends of the Boundary Waters Wilderness and the strength of protecting the Boundary Waters. So thank you so much. This program will be recorded and available on our website. So I know we didn't get to all the questions out there, but if you are able to watch, you can get more information about the route that Jason took and the lake that he camped at, and those some other details about that. And you can also read the book again. Read the book, get the book Lost in the Wild there. So
I also was going to mention it's available on Audible if anybody is interested in listening to it, rather.
Great. So, all right. Well, have a great rest of the afternoon, everyone. And thank you again, Cary, for a great presentation. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.